Hello there, and a very good afternoon. You are watching our weekly now Ukraine Q&A with Professor Michael Clarke, our military and security analyst. Professor Clarke, it's always great to have you. I get to speak to you all the time. I'm very lucky, but our viewers now get to...
I always enjoy these sessions between you and I.
We do have a nice time, and it's always great to be able to pull things out of your brain. And thankfully, viewers, you get to ask questions as well. And you have once again sent in many of your questions for us. So let's not waste any more time and get straight into them. This first question comes from Matthew O'Brien, Professor, and it's this. Are these moves by the Kremlin over the past few days a direct reaction to Trump saying he could potentially walk away from negotiations? Why is Putin deciding to hold peace talks now? Can we take him seriously? What's in it for him? And of course, this comes in the past 12 hours that we've heard these moves that President Putin is willing to kind of discuss a pause in the conflict.
Yeah. I mean, we know that Putin doesn't want to stop fighting on the ground because he believes he's going to make gains, and he is, although he's made almost none in the last month. He believes he will make gains, and the weather is now favourable to a new offensive, and there may well be one developing. So he doesn't want a peace deal. He certainly doesn't want a ceasefire at the moment. However, he knows that Trump is losing patience. He knows that Trump is losing interest. And so this is not because he wants to move to a peace agreement, but that he wants to keep President Trump on the hook so that as and when ceasefire talks fail, as they look as if they probably will, may not, but they probably will, he wants to make sure that President Trump blames the Ukrainians and the Europeans for it. It's a way of shifting the blame and making it clear that President Putin, was willing to talk about all these things, but of course they're very complicated and with all sorts of things we've got to discuss first. Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, always says, well, this is all positive, but don't underestimate all the details we've got to get right. Whereas Zelensky this morning said he wants an immediate, unconditional and complete ceasefire. He said it again this morning.
Yeah.
Immediate, unconditional and complete. I agree to it. Why don't they agree to it? And the Russians will not agree to that because they don't want a ceasefire. But they're trying to maneuver President Trump into the point where he moves away from the whole idea, moves on to a different issue. He blames somebody other than them.
And Matthew's question talks about the sequencing, of course, because we heard last week, wasn't it, from Rubio and from Trump as well, saying that, unless there's something agreed, we're going to step away. Trump said, if there's no deal, we'll walk away from this. And then we had President Putin suggesting this Easter truce for 30 hours, which, of course, didn't hold at all.
Never took place. No, I mean, it never would have taken place because in a front line of 1,000 kilometres in which you've got 750,000 Russians and 500,000 Ukrainians fighting along that line, just declaring a truce like that is never going to happen, even with the best will in the world, because people just don't hear about it in time, don't get the orders, and so on. There's a momentum. It takes some days to organise a truce. So just declaring something is just pure symbolism. And British intelligence, it's now officially stated by John Healey yesterday in the House of Commons, he said Defence Intelligence confirms that no truce took place on the Russian side.
They continued fighting.
He said they did not find any, he said, John Healey said, Defence Intelligence did not find any evidence of a ceasefire along the Russian lines. That's what he said.
I think it was borne out in the casualty numbers reported by the Ukrainians that were shown by their offensive manoeuvres that they were trying to attack Ukrainian positions continually.
Yes, I mean, it was a gesture from the Kremlin. Again, it was part of the idea of keeping President Trump on the hook, keep President Trump interested enough in Putin's good faith so that when this whole process is likely to fail, that the blame will attach to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and Trump will still want to make a strategic deal with Russia over minerals and trade and releasing the sanctions.
Matthew's last question in this, and that's one I've asked you since February of 2022 to get inside Putin's head. Matthew asks, can we take him seriously?
Well, we can take Putin very seriously in terms of what he intends. What he's intended since 2007, that we know of for definite, is to recreate as much of the old Soviet empire in Eastern and Central Europe as possible. And he'll do that by different means. But he believes that that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a historic injustice to the Slavic peoples and to the Russians, and that he, as a leader, he feels he has a duty to history to put that right as far as he possibly can while he's in power. So in that respect, he's consistent, he's believable, he's not hard to understand, and you can read anything you like that he's said in the last 10 years. You won't find anything against that idea. You won't find any contrary ideas to the ones I've just expressed.
He's been telling us and has been showing us with his actions over that.
Maya Angelou, the famous American writer, she said, when somebody shows you their true self, you should believe them first time.
Yeah, exactly.
We should have believed him in 2007. That was his true self.
Okay, question now from Fern. Putin may want to end the war along current lines for the reasons you've laid out, Michael, but does Russia really have control of the areas on the maps which haven't changed much? Or is there a resistance, as there were in parts of occupied Europe, and especially by the French during World War II?
Yeah, no, he doesn't have control of all the areas he claims. When the war started, the Russians had complete control of Crimea, which they'd had since 2014. They had about a third of the area of Donetsk and Luhansk, these two regions, which they controlled through the militias. So they had about a third of that. And they didn't have any control over Kherson or Zaporizhia. Since this third war began in 2022, February 2022, they went from a third of control of Donetsk and Luhansk to two-thirds of control of those provinces, about two-thirds of Zaporizhia, which they took, and they took the whole of Kherson, and then got kicked out of about a third of it in the autumn of 2022 in the Ukrainian offensive then. And so they've moved from roughly controlling a third of the provinces they claim, the 4 new provinces they claim, to controlling more than two-thirds of them, three-quarters of some of them. But they don't have control of all of the provinces that they claim are now Russian.
Remind us, when do they hold those phony election referendums in those provinces?
Oh, after September 2022. They declared them annexed in 22, and then they held these referendums in I can't remember the date offhand, but I think it was the spring of 2023. And they were completely phony, and which showed that they said that the majority of people living there wanted to be Russian.
Yeah. The other point from Fern's question as well is about the resistance and the resistance fighters. And there are some known resistance fighting groups, aren't there? There's a group called Atesh that fights, I think, out of Crimea as well. And there are other groups, Yellow Ribbon as well. This is another resistance movement. There are numbers.
Yeah, there are. And there was a lot of civil resistance in Kherson to begin with, in the city of Kherson, when the Russians first moved in. But, in those days, this is late 2022, mid to late 2022, the thing was a bit gentle then. The resistance was civil disobedience and demonstrations on the street. You could tell from the the sort of video clips we saw, the Russian soldiers were, young professional soldiers. They didn't quite know how to react because they were talking to Russian-speaking people who they thought of as more or less Russian. And there was a sort of a sense of a standoff. And it was all a bit, gentle is not the right word, but it wasn't brutal. But since then, the FSB have moved in, and there is a sort of Gestapo element now to all resistance. And so these groups are not really now civil disobedience groups. These are resistance groups in a Second World War sense.
Partisans fighting.
Partisans, they're carrying out assassinations. They are, in Russian terms, terrorists. And the Russians respond with a very brutal sort of counter-terrorism, exactly as they'd done in Chechnya, exactly as they did in Syria, exactly as they've done in parts of eastern Libya and in quite a few parts now of Africa through the Wagner Group. And so the prospect of Ukrainians offering resistance to Russian occupation is always there, and it will go on, I'm sure, but it will be a vicious sort of war, as indeed it was in occupied Europe during the period 1940 to 44.
What do we know about how they receive support, what kind of numbers there are, what kind of weaponry they use? I know they commit sabotage attacks, firebombings, and, as you say, assassinations. But do we know if they're getting direct state support or outside support?
They're certainly getting support from Ukraine, from the SVU in SVU, SUV, I can't remember. SBU.
SBU.
Yeah, which is Budanov's outfit in Ukraine, military intelligence. Actually, I've got that wrong again. The GUR, I beg your pardon, the GUR in Ukraine, military intelligence. And they certainly push aid towards some of these groups and give them weapons. If there's a group who's prepared to make Russia's life harder and attack military targets, then they're certainly prepared to help them.
Right. So they are receiving support and effective in many. I suppose the fact that they exist, the fact that they can keep some Russian defenders on the hop is resistance enough.
It is, but
never the idea that they could turn something over.
Yeah, they won't turn strategically the whole thing. They can't. They never would. But they can continue to exist and they can continue to keep the flame of resistance alive if they're brave enough to do that. But if there is a ceasefire deal, it will be much harder for them because implicitly Kiev will have had to accept that ceasefire deal whereby de facto 20% of the territory will be under Russian control for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Not forever, as far as Kiev is concerned. There will be a time when they'll get it back. They have to believe that. But for the foreseeable future, then that will continue. And it's much, much harder to be a brave resistance fighter if you think it's not going to make any difference in your lifetime.
Yeah.
And your lifetime, of course, might be quite short if you want to take these resistance activities.
Clarifying the intense difficulty it would be for any acceptance. And that's on to Jim's next question then. What are the chances of Zelensky accepting land loss to end the war? And what could his red lines be?
Well, Zelensky had indicated, as the Americans began to put more and more pressure on him to move towards this situation, that in practice they would be prepared to entertain a ceasefire along these current lines of conflict. So what he has said is, we will never give up our right to these territories, but we may do a deal which effectively cedes these territories for the foreseeable future to Russian control. And so that's, in a sense, is not a particular red line for Zelensky. He says that Crimea is a red line, that he won't cede the sovereignty of Crimea, and I can understand that. But in a way, he doesn't have to. He can keep his claim to Crimea alive, even though, I mean, on present trends, the United States look as if they're offering to recognize the legality of Russian occupation of Crimea. But I mean, if the US recognizes it, doesn't mean to say everybody else will. I doubt if most of the European powers will, not the major European powers, because that is a fundamental blow to the principles of international law. And those principles, laid out not originally, but laid out very strongly at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and then the Congress of Versailles in 1919, that European borders should not be changed by force and recognized as change. And so I think the European powers would have real trouble if the Americans said, we will recognize the legality of Russian control over Crimea. So, Zelensky, in a sense, doesn't have to give that one up. He can keep that claim, even though he knows in his heart that Crimea will not come back to Ukraine in this century. It would be, there would have to be a very big turn of the wheel for Crimea to come back towards Ukraine in a real sense. But it doesn't stop them keeping up the facade, for the sake of international law, that Crimea should belong to
and continue to demand it. I mean, it's entirely annexed, but the other four that aren't entirely annexed as well. If Zelensky were to accept the terms of this deal, freezing it in place and then ceding that territory, it's not just the fact that he would have to give up those that have been fighting in those lands for him for all this time. There are political constitutional issues as well they'd have to deal with.
I mean, Ukraine would be a smaller country then. Instead of a country of 44 million, it's now probably a country of, say, 35, 36 million in reality. There's about 3.5 to 4 million Ukrainians still living in the occupied territories. And, I mean, they're being pressurized all the time into becoming Russian. They're under real pressure, and it's happening all the time. They're made to have Russian passports. So they can't access common services unless they can show they've got a Russian passport. And that
they're being made to speak Russian as well.
A lot of them do. I mean,
they already do speak Russian, but that is now...
Many do, yeah. I mean, it was something like well over 50% of those areas, apart from Kherson, wasn't quite so strong, but well over 50% were Russian speakers in any case. And
suppression of Ukrainian.
They're made to speak Russian in public, and they're made to have Russian passports. And so the Russians can claim, this is just a process of liberating the Russian-speaking peoples. It's very dangerous. I mean, again, we had all this in the 1930s. Once you start claiming that people who speak a certain language belong to you, then that's the basis of national expansion. It's always been the case.
Yeah, very challenging. All right, Martin, where there's a will, asks, great handle, Martin, what could be the win-win-win for deal that could bring the Ukraine war to an end and would satisfy Ukraine, Russia, the US and Europe? Big question there.
There isn't one, Martin. It would depend on Russia and Ukraine agreeing that Ukraine is genuinely a separate country and that the Russians living with that within a framework of just sort of cultural acceptance. And they won't do that. I mean, you and I have said before, Kiev goes back to 482, right? The city of Kiev was founded in 482. And Novgorod, the first Russian city, wasn't founded until 600 years later. Moscow, 200 years after that. Kiev is the center of Slavic culture. And that's why both the Ukrainians feel that they're absolutely right to feel Ukrainian, and the Russians feel that Ukraine has to be part of Russia because it's part of the birthplace of Slavic culture. Kiev was the greatest city in the Slavic world. And you know, the Harold II of England, right? Harold, the man, Battle of Hastings, reputedly died with the arrow in the eye.
Yeah,
right?
remember
Lost
from
the
my
Battle of
books.
Hastings,
Absolutely.
William the Conqueror. Right. Harold's eldest daughter escaped to Denmark, married a Russian who became the Grand Prince of Kiev.
Wow, okay.
Right, in the 11th century. And through intermarriage back into the Danish royal family, a little bit of the DNA of Harold of Wessex, who lost the Battle of Hastings, a little bit of his DNA is in our royal family, is in our King Charles III today, as we speak. And the reason that bit of DNA, going back to the Battle of Hastings, is in our royal family is because the Grand Princes of Kiev were so important in global politics in the 11th century. So nothing to do with Moscow or the Russians.
It goes all the way back to that point. And, and that speaks to just how intractable it is, because this imagined idea that Putin has had, and of course that comes from Soviet times as well, and from the Russian imperial...
a long way.
Is what he's trying to bring in at this point now, and that's why you can't have those two.
So it'll never be reconciled. These two different versions of whether Ukraine could be separate or not. It simply has to be handled within an institutional basis, which sees it as you and I, as liberals, would see it as a cultural strength. But of course, people will fight over it, and have fought over it long and hard for many generations. Somehow, there'll only be a win-win-win-win when that becomes institutionally settled and can be handled in if you like, a generous way, as opposed to a zero-sum way, which is the way it's sort of at the moment. It's zero-sum. If you have more control over your territory, then we have less.
Yeah, I mean, Martin has that where there's a will in his handle, so I'm going to see if there is a will here at all. In those regions that are predominantly Russian-speaking, if you were to have referendum and those people there were to decide in which country they chose to live going forward, could you find a win there that then would satisfy the Russians if Ukraine never joined NATO or did join NATO? Well, and then the US and Russia would be satisfied. US and Europe will be satisfied by the war coming to an end and no longer having to support.
Yeah, the principle in modern thinking, the principle of self-determination is very important. It doesn't trump everything else, but it is very important. So if it were genuinely the case that the people living in a territory wanted to belong to a certain country, then in general that's a very strong argument for saying, well, let them belong to that country. If that's what they genuinely wanted. And of course the Russians are playing on the idea that, look, if they just create this colonization in 2 or 3 generations, by the 2060s, 2070s, everybody there will genuinely
Everyone's got Russian passports, of course.
Exactly.
Become Russians, aren't they?
They'll be second and third generation from the invasion, and people will forget the circumstances of what happened. And that's self-determination. And that is a principle which can go, as it were, counter to the principle of international law that boundaries can't be changed by force. But what we're holding on to at the moment is that boundaries can only be changed by consent. And one of the elements of consent is self-determination. But we're a long way from that in the occupied territories at the moment.
Simple answer then, no. There's no satisfying for all parties involved in this at this point. Right, on to the question from Mitchell. If Ukraine has proved one thing, or at least Russia's invasion of Ukraine has proved one thing, it's that even with sociopaths in charge, the world is unlikely to ever descend into nuclear warfare, ?
Yeah, the nuclear question comes up a lot. We've talked about it a lot, and because it keeps coming up, I realise it must be on people's minds. And I think it's right. Again, as we've said before, nuclear deterrence, the whole concept of nuclear deterrence, works better in practice than it does in theory. The theory is full of holes. I've never liked nuclear deterrence theory, but I recognise that in practice, all leaders, they know what nuclear weapons do. We know what sort of destruction they bring because we've seen it. We test it. And therefore, there is a great reluctance to move to nuclear weapons in reality. But too many leaders now are prepared to rattle the sabres. They're prepared to threaten. They're prepared to hint at it. In reality, nothing has happened in this war, which in Ukraine, which brings us any nearer to a nuclear exchange than we were before.
I was going to say, is anything in terms of the fighting risen to the level where you could think that
none of it.
There may be any kind of pretext to use one?
None of it has. And I think, again, the basis, this is where nuclear deterrence does sort of work in practice. Nobody would go there, given the consequences, and the unpredictability of what would happen next. We know what the destruction would be if a first exchange of weapons or first use of weapons, but we've no idea what would happen next, because everything would be off the table then. It would just be chaos. Because of that, nobody is going to go towards nuclear use unless they feel their basic country is threatened, unless they really feel their very existence is threatened. That's what the Israelis assume, although they'd never admit that they've got nuclear weapons, but we all know they have. That's what they assume. That's what the Russians say. That's what the West says, Britain and America, France. We all say it's a weapon of last resort. If we felt that our very existence, our core existence was being threatened, then we might use them. But for anything less than that, why would you do it? Why would you? You know, when you've no idea what will happen next.
Where it will go next. Indulge us, Michael. The Ukrainians gave up their weapons, their nuclear weapons, in what, 1994?
1994, yeah.
Right? Would the invasion have happened had they been able to hold on to those weapons?
I doubt it. That was the point. This is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians feel so embittered about this. I mean, they inherited nuclear weapons from the old Soviet Union, and they had the best stock of them, actually. There were three countries inherited them, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Belarus and Kazakhstan gave them up willingly because they couldn't really do much with them. The Ukrainians, because they're technically very sophisticated and because of the siting of some of the fields, they could have made them work. And they did possess them, and they drove a very hard bargain in Budapest in 1994, and Russia, America, and Britain gave them a security guarantee if they gave up their nuclear weapons. France also, they didn't go in with the tripartite thing, but France then gave a separate guarantee. So in reality, you know, America, Russia, Britain and France all guaranteed Ukrainian security if they gave up nuclear weapons, which they then did after a tough bargain. And now they say, look, you know, if we'd had weapons, if we'd had them and we knew how to use them, the Russians wouldn't have dared.
What was the political leadership in Ukraine like at that time? Sorry to
it was corrupt.
Right.
and it wasn't very good. That was the point. I mean, like all the post-Soviet states, it was fairly pro-Moscow, and that was what created the famous Orange Revolution, which is where things really began to diverge between Moscow and Kiev. But I mean, if the Russians had got to the point in 2022 with the Ukraine that we then had, or even 2014, where Ukraine had real control over its weapons, it would have been a very risky thing for the Russians to have undertaken. Would they have done it? I suspect not, but of course we'll never know.
No, we never will. But
the Ukrainians are convinced. They're convinced.
They're convinced they would not have
that the Russians wouldn't have invaded if they hadn't given up their weapons.
I mean, Michael, I think it would be extraordinary to think that they would have invaded a nuclear-armed neighbour in this way.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Before we go into our quick fire round, I've got a question that's coming from YouTube. Thank you very much for that. Super Duper Tech, who has asked, how long do we think it will be before the USA does what it says and walk away from the table? I think it's a good question because we are running up to 100 days.
Yeah.
He said 24 hours he's going to do it. Failed. And then he said, I'm going to get peace in 100 days, and that's coming up.
Well, actually, Keith Kellogg said 100 days, and then Trump said, more like 6 months. But 100 days has always been this sort of figure that hangs over every president. It goes back to Kennedy, the first 100 days. You know, it's so momentous, the Kennedy sort of presidency.
Arbitrary.
And everything's become a sort of 100-day probation period. Yeah. And so that 100 days runs out, I think it's on the 30th of this month, which is next week. And so that's why Trump is putting great pressure on everybody to do a deal. And I think, will he walk away? Yes, I think he will. I mean, I think he will personally. But the US might stay in it a bit longer if they thought they could get something out of it. But I don't think they can get anything out of it really. And I think that Trump will walk away in a couple of weeks' time. That's my guess. But if we're still talking, then Kamali, if we're having a Q&A, then you can ask me again.
I hope that we are still talking then, Michael, and I want to push you on that. Do you really think he's going to walk away? I mean, look, they haven't agreed another package of weapons yet, so we're already seeing that. That's a signal, isn't it? They'd have to organise that, get the votes done. You think he could just leave it?
I think he'd kick it into the long grass.
And focus on other stuff.
And he'll focus on Iran. And say he'll blame the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And there's a parting of the ways coming between the United States and Europe here. And we'll see that if it goes as badly as I think it may go, and I hope I'm wrong, then we'll see that at the NATO summit at the end of June, 24th to 26th of June.
The Ukrainians are hoping you're wrong as well,
will be a humdinger when we get there.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to another couple of questions. I'm going to pause the quickfire for a bit because I've got a few questions that have come in from the app. Thank you very much for this. John has a question here. Given Kaliningrad's contribution to the Russian economy, that's the exclave. Kaliningrad, yep. It's the Russian exclave. Why has the West not considered closing its Polish and Lithuanian borders, severing road and rail links, and forcing all transit of goods and people to be conducted by air and sea? So squeezing the exclave.
It's done quite a lot.
It has.
Okay. As a result of the war, it actually started to cut off Kaliningrad from ground transport. It's this area called the Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which is one of these things that NATO thinks about a lot, the Suwalki Gap. And it is literally a corridor about it's only a few miles wide and about 60 miles long, 60, 80 miles long. Mm-hmm. And that links Kaliningrad, which is Russian territory, with Belarus, which is, of course, an ally. But as a result of the sanctions that were imposed immediately after the Russian invasion in 2022, a lot more stuff has been having to come by sea to Kaliningrad. So Kaliningrad is being squeezed, and the Russians do feel it.
They do. Could it be squeezed more?
It could, yes, it could. And it is a sort of pressure point, Kaliningrad. I mean, a lot of people in NATO, they worry that Kaliningrad is a sort of an outpost of Russian aggression against NATO. I think it's the other way around. I mean, Kaliningrad is an outpost of vulnerability because it's surrounded by NATO, by and large. Unless the Russians were prepared to charge through the Suwalki Gap, and cut off the Baltic states. And that was what they used to worry about. But that was before Sweden and Finland came into NATO. And so in the Baltic is now effectively a NATO lake in that respect. So Kaliningrad is in a much more difficult strategic position now, with Finland as a very useful member of NATO, sitting right over the other side of the Gulf of Finland.
What's that saying from the Second World War about squeezing Berlin? Wasn't that a phrase that was used to try during the Berlin airlift? Like if you wanted to upset the other side,
that's right. You squeezed it. Yeah. We put pressure on them. Yeah, that was 10 months of Berlin airlift. Yeah. And Berlin was kept supplied. I mean, the British and the Americans together. This was like the old routine. This was how close they were then. They kept Berlin supplied with more than they had before the blockade. In that 10 months of literally aircraft every 30 seconds or so landing. It was a terrific effort, and they kept Berlin supplied. And eventually the Soviets had to they just gave up. They said we couldn't squeeze West Berlin enough by blockading it by road.
Right, another question from the app. This is from Andrew Alonzi. Very polite, Andrew. Thank you for this. Dear Professor Clarke, what are the broad contours of the American plan so far as we know them? Tell us about American interests in these negotiations. Is America an impartial mediator or an interested party? And then thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah. What it tells us about American motivations is that the American objective is to create a rapprochement with Russia. I mean, the Trump administration...
Are you convinced now that is
totally
where they want to get to?
Personally, yeah. I mean, that's what they want. They want a new relationship with Russia for all sorts of economic reasons and geostrategic reasons. So economically, they think there's so much good trade to be done with Russia by getting rid of sanctions. Don't worry about the morality issue. Don't worry about the international law. That's all for liberals. Just do some hard-nosed trade deals, get hold of minerals that the Russians have got to sell, and... pull Russia away from China. That's their geopolitical thinking. Now, I think that's extremely superficial thinking, but there you go. That's what they think. So there's a good economic motive. For them, there's a good geopolitical motive. And as we've said before, I mean, Trump doesn't really care what happens to Ukraine. He just wants to get it out of the way. He just wants it off the table. And that suits Putin. If Trump moves on, Putin continues with the war. As long as he just keeps pushing steadily for more and more control over Ukraine, the Americans will have given up on it, and Putin can still pursue a rapprochement with America, which brings him back from the cold. I mean, he's been a pariah since 2014. He's been a pariah, and a complete pariah since 2022. Now Trump is offering him the chance to come back into the world fold, the world community, as one of the three big dictators. I mean, Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping will organise the rest of the world.
Can that thought be detached from Trump's first term and what he described as the Russia hoax, but those rumours, insinuation of closeness and the evidence that some people say have found that shows the closeness of Donald Trump to...
It is. I mean, you never know quite what the motivations are for what Trump thinks, because he's so... I mean, in some ways he's consistent, in other ways he's completely inconsistent. Depends, how...
He's been consistent in not wanting to criticise Vladimir Putin.
For sure. He's the one world leader he will not criticise. And he does seem to feel an affinity because he's so bruised by by what was said in the and what was done in the election campaigns up to 2016, and then during his first term. And the fact that the way the law has pursued him, in his view, completely unjustly, he thinks he's the subject of a witch hunt. I mean, like all the great autocrats, George Orwell used to talk about this. He has a sense of injustice. First of all, I am a victim. All the great dictators say they're victims. And secondly, they say they are setting right a historical injustice. So I'm the victim, Donald Trump. I've been subjected, like Vladimir Putin, to the most outrageous slurs, etc. And I'm setting right a historic injustice to the way America's been treated by the rest of the world and its allies, just as Putin is responding to a historic injustice of what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Dictators, Orwell was dead right about that. Sense of victimhood and a sense of injustice. That's what drives them on.
Certainly does. All right, let's move on to the quick fire questions, Michael. I'm looking forward to this. I don't know if you can answer a question in 30 seconds, but we are going to try.
Go on, I will. I promise.
You can do it, Michael. Come on. All right, the first one here is from Lee. I'm not going to time it, Michael, but we'll try to keep them short. If Ukraine rejects giving up Crimea and carries on without US help, with just Europe by its side, what is the most likely scenario for the war in the months and years that follow?
Ukraine can continue fighting. It's not a small state. It can keep on going. Two key questions are, can it keep on going if the Americans withdraw their intelligence help? And the answer is yes, but not so well. And then the bigger question is, do the Americans turn off Starlink? Which is
Elon
absolutely
Musk's
critical.
satellite.
That's
Right.
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And if they were to turn off Starlink and withdraw their intelligence help, then Ukraine will certainly lose territory because the Europeans can't compensate for that.
But as you said, I think that was in 30 seconds, but as you have said, in 5 to 10 years, the Europeans could perhaps replace some of...
Yes, they could, but not this year, not next year.
5 to 10, that's a long time, and a long time for them to continue fighting. All right,
maybe,
good.
Maybe more. I mean, maybe 3 to 4 years if they really went for it, but not 2025, not 2026.
Right. On to a question now from Pellister. We're still in the quick fire round. What does pulling out of meetings achieve? Of course, they've stopped. The Marco Rubio and Witkoff have decided not to come to this meeting in London today. What can we learn from this?
Yeah, Sabir is still there, who's the Ukrainian foreign minister, and Umarov, the defense minister. So they're there because they can't afford not to be. What does it achieve? It downgrades the level of the meeting. It downgrades what the meeting can do. It doesn't mean to say the meeting can't take place, but it means that the people who need to talk to each other are somewhere else. And it shows that the United States really is only consulting the Europeans because it thinks it has to, not because it wants to.
Yeah.
It's not really going to run this initiative through the Europeans, and it's a diplomatic insult to say, well, we'd rather be talking to the Russians directly than the people who you are fighting with, the Ukrainians or the Europeans, who are trying to do their best to help.
You would have thought, in light of what Putin said, they'd want to all be around the table to assess his offer or whatever the offer is at this point.
But it suits both America and Russia, given their various objectives, to deal separately with people. Good faith negotiations, you say, get all the stakeholders together. Let's all sit round and work out who can do something. If you're not really out negotiating in good faith because you've got other objectives in mind, you do it bilaterally. That's really what's happening.
On to a question from Gold Geezer. Given the failed offensive of the last few years, what percentage chance would you give Ukraine of regaining significant amounts of land should an agreement not be reached?
Very low. The Ukrainians can hold on. They can keep avoiding losing too much more, but they're not going to take any more ground from the Russians unless they can build up their military hardware again with Western help, with European help. And that's not impossible, but it isn't going to happen this year. If they keep on fighting this year, they might hold on in reasonable shape, and they might be able to conduct some surprise local offensives, which might shock the Russians and push them off balance a little bit. And they've certainly got some good ideas to do that, I think. But the idea of regaining good swathes of territory depends on whether they could keep going for more than another year, and whether the Europeans, the big European powers like Britain and France and Germany, are prepared to really commit to helping Ukraine.
Well, that moves on to our next question from David. Are there any weapons the West could realistically give to Ukraine that would fundamentally change the course of the war in their favour?
Yeah, air power. Air power is what the Ukrainians most lack for operations on the ground. And so if they had European help, and this could come in lots of different ways, with aircraft and air-launched weapons, if they had better air defence against Russian air power. So in other words, if they could create some air superiority over their own territory, real superiority, that would make a big difference. And the other thing is there a single weapon that would now make a difference? Yeah, Taurus missiles.
From the Germans.
The German Taurus missiles, which Chancellor Scholz has said he will not give in any circumstances, and Friedrich Merz said he will want to give, but he's got to persuade his SDP colleagues that they should agree to it. I think the Germans will, and Taurus missiles will make a difference, yeah.
If you don't mind, everyone, I'm just going to get you to expand a bit on that. So when you say air power, what do you mean? Because they've got the F-16s. What should they
need
have? F-22s, F-35s. I mean, what kind of airframe do they need to?
They need more of their own aircraft and trained pilots to use them. And F-16s are fine, but they need others as well, as the Rafale and so on. I mean, there are other European aircraft. More than that, if the Europeans were prepared to do it, would be to actually the European air forces to run a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
You've taken on to one of the questions later, but carry on.
Say over Western Ukraine.
Yeah.
Say the Europeans ran a no-fly zone and were prepared to shoot down incoming missiles, ballistic missiles that may be coming in from Russia. So in other words, the Europeans were part of the defensive war that the Ukrainians were fighting, so that the Ukrainians could use all of their air power for their offensive operations. That might make a difference on the ground in a way that the Russians would find very difficult.
Okay, my last follow-up then on the Taurus. Why the Taurus? Because they've already got Storm Shadow coming from us and Scalp.
Storm Shadow and Scalp, which is the French version of the Storm Shadow missile. Taurus is a better range, heavier warhead generally, and a better warhead.
Right.
I mean, Taurus is really good at blowing up bridges, like the Kerch Bridge,
right?
And fixed installations. It really does a lot of damage to key installations in exactly the way you would want. It's not the sort of thing you would use against civilians, of course, but it's very good against military and infrastructure installations.
Very interesting. Good question there, David. And I wonder, with what's happening in Germany, whether that Taurus has been talked about a long time, closer now than.
Yeah, they should have had them 2 years ago. Yeah. But I think under Friedrich Merz, when he formally comes into power as Chancellor, which is very close now, then I think if he's persuaded the SPD to go along with it, then they'll allocate Taurus missiles. And the Ukrainians, I think, will be very glad of them as and when they arrive.
Last of the quickfire. I think these are still quickfire, Michael.
Just about.
This is just the last one. This is from John. What's Putin's long game if he gets a deal? Could he attack in Ukraine again, seize Moldova, or target a NATO country?
Yes to all of those.
Right.
Yes to try to take the rest of Ukraine at some point, but he might, if there is some sort of ceasefire, he might want to hold off while Trump is in power, so as to just bank that gain and then come back to it when Trump has left office. Moldova, certainly, the Russians have been trying to sow discord in Moldova for some time, and Moldova is a very weak state. Also, intervention in Georgia, if they feel that Georgia was slipping away, which I don't think it is, from Russian control, but I mean, if they felt it was because of the demonstrations which are still ongoing on a daily basis, they might do that. Pressure on the Baltics. I mean, what the Russians want to do is to show that NATO is not competent to use Article 5, the attack on one is an attack on all. And by pressuring one of the allies, one of the smaller allies, probably in the Baltics, they might be able to show other members of NATO in the south that NATO won't defend you. That we can grab a little bit of territory, or we can create a problem, and there's nothing NATO can do to stop it.
Probing that fence.
Exactly,
I mean,
just probing. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, as well as more cyber attacks, more cable cutting, all the sort of things that we see. All of that is going. I mean, again, British intelligence will tell you the incidence of all of those things is going up and up and up all the time.
Okay, we can move on to normal length answers now, Michael. You'll be pleased to know you don't have to speak 30 seconds. Not that you have. All right, this is a question here from Chris, and it's about the air defence, basically, this no-fly zone. Chris's question, thank you. Sir Richard Barron's recently discussed the concept of Sky Shield. How feasible is it for the UK, Europe to implement a Sky Shield to shoot down Russian ballistic missiles and drones in the west of Ukraine, or even here in the UK? And is it needed?
Yeah, it would be desirable. Whether or not it's needed, it's certainly desirable. The thing about Sky Shields, as in, Israel's Iron Dome, remember the Iron Dome system in Israel covers Israel's a very small country compared to any European country pretty well, and certainly can say compared to the United Kingdom. The thing about shooting down missiles is that you can you can defend a big territory against just a little handful of missiles. So you could defend the whole of the United Kingdom against half a dozen missiles, if that's all that you were facing. Or you can defend a small area, like air bases or even maybe a city, one city, against a lot of missiles. So you say there were 40 or 50 missiles coming against London. It's conceivable that you could have a system that could shoot down 40 or 50 missiles against that. But you can't defend a big area against a lot of missiles. It just can't be done. And it can't be done in America, it can't be done in Russia, right? Because it's just the nature of missile technologies. It costs a lot more to defend against an incoming missile, a ballistic missile, unless you can knock it down in some other clever way, electronically or with lasers and so on. And the United States is now, Trump has just been talking about a Golden Dome.
Right? Just pulled it up, Michael, to talk about it. Yeah, I've got it there. Yeah. No, I've just got some more details about it. Yeah, I remembered him talking
like the Iron Dome. And this is the idea of space-based weapons to hit missiles on the way in.
Yeah.
Now, that's just like Star Wars of October 1983. I was
Reagan,
doing research in the US at the time when that all came out. And again, the issues about Star Wars, I mean, the idea of space-based systems that are sitting in space on satellites, it's not scientifically difficult. It's just heroic engineering.
Okay.
Can you engineer what you need and put it in space, make it 10 times more lethal, and service it, and know that it will work first time when you need it, when there's no margin of error?
Sounds expensive.
Very, very expensive. And that's the other issue, the economic side. That it is always, so far, it's always cheaper to be on the offense than the defense.
Right.
And I used to say to people in the Star Wars debate in the States, you give me one of the technologies, any one you like, and I will give you, off the top of my head, 3 or 4 ways of more cheaply countering it.
Right.
I can give you ways to counter what you've just said much more cheaply than you can put it up in space. So it was never a scientific issue. It was always a heroic engineering issue. Still the case. Still the case. And this goes back to the late 1960s. People have been looking at shooting down missiles since 1966, 67. And it's still the same basis, that you can defend a small area against a lot of missiles or a big area against a few. But that's about it so far.
Practically just not possible for that. An area of Western
No,
Ukraine,
and you can
just
choose.
the site.
You say, okay, well, if there are 3 or 4 things we really have to defend, let's spend the money on defending them. That's a choice you might want to make.
Yeah.
But the idea of whole countries sitting under some sort of Iron Dome like Israel does, and remember, Iron Dome has not been 100% successful. It's been very successful, but not 100%. And the idea of other countries sitting under some sort of Iron Dome is still, I say, in the realm of science fiction.
Right. Let's move on to a question here from JB. Will the West ever stipulate their own red lines for Russia? And will they ever remove the restrictions imposed on Ukraine to really strike back?
No, I don't think they will remove those restrictions. I mean, the West Europeans, in helping Ukraine carry on, which I think they probably will, after the failure of a ceasefire, which is what I suspect is going to happen. I'm not absolutely predicting it, but that's what I think is more likely to happen. In that respect, the West Europeans will always want to avoid the idea that we are taking on Russia directly, because we don't want to do that. I mean, it's never been our intention to go to war with Russia. We will defend ourselves against Russia if they go to war with us, which increasingly they'll, because if they have a mind to do in different ways, I mean, not all-out ways, but ways that we will find unacceptable. But we don't want to get into a war with Russia. We've got no interest in trying to destroy Russia, despite what Putin says, nor could we even if we wanted to.
I suppose in JB's question, though, it's this question of whether or not Ukraine can really strike back. I mean, what would Ukraine really striking back look like? We already talked, of course, they haven't got...
Well, it looked like more of the same, Kamali, in the sense that, striking back against military targets, against, ammunition dumps and infrastructure, military infrastructure.
With longer-range weapons hitting deep.
Yeah, longer range,
Russian
trying to
homeland.
hit the thing that the forces need. What the Ukrainians don't want to do is start attacking Russian civilians or Russian cities. It would be pointless for Ukraine to get into an all-out war with Russia, who is 8 times bigger than it.
Yeah.
Why would it? What Ukraine wants to do is simply defend itself against this Russian aggression and convince the Russians over however many years it may take that conquering Ukraine is just not worth it, and it's better just to back off and think again. That's the best they can hope for.
Well, maybe they're going to be this, what do they call it, the steel porcupine. That's how
That's right.
they're trying to have
Can they make themselves so difficult to conquer that the Russians will just give up for a while, at least for a while, and rethink, and then just hope that in the 10 years that might elapse then, that Russian approaches to the world might alter.
We'll see. A couple more questions now then, Michael. Thank you for this. Daryl TS, does the West / NATO need Ukraine more than they need us, and why?
No, the West doesn't need Ukraine. The West feels a responsibility to Ukraine, both because Ukraine, like most of the post-Soviet states, has lent towards the West, certainly initially, and wanted to join the sort of family of free trading liberal democracies. But we absolutely don't need Ukraine. And in some respects, Ukraine in the European Union would be quite difficult to accommodate because it's a big country with a very big agricultural sector. And that would make it quite a difficult country to you would have to adjust the common agricultural policy, for instance, to quite a big extent.
They've begun accession talks, haven't they?
Yeah, And they are on the road to membership of the EU, but it will be a very different sort of membership to the membership of other smaller countries coming in, because Ukraine's it's a pretty big country to take into any organization. So no, the West doesn't need Ukraine. It feels a responsibility to it and a sympathy for it. And this is what's driven Western enlargement, which has so enraged the Russians. NATO has never wanted to enlarge itself for the sake of it. It's always responded to other countries saying, please, can we come in? It's always demand-led. They all wanted to join NATO for the security it offers. They all wanted to join the EU for the prosperity it offers. And neither the EU, I think, had a bit of an expansionist agenda. NATO never had an expansionist agenda. When NATO, again, I've said this before, when NATO was 15 and 16 nations, it was pretty efficient. Now there is 32. It's much harder to run, much harder to manage. And most of the nations that have come in, apart from Poland and Finland and Sweden, those are the only nations that have come in that have really added something to NATO militarily.
Right.
All the others give you commitments without really making very much contribution.
We could have a whole podcast discussion about NATO and the state of it ahead of... When is the
end of June, 24th, 26th of June, yeah.
Well, we'll still be talking, Michael, so we'll do a special on that, maybe. All right, final question now, and this has come from Gary C. Thank you very much. Gary, thank you for all your questions this afternoon. What is the real state of the Russian army? YouTube is awash with military channels that would make you believe Russia is on its knees. Who do we believe?
Well, Russia's on its third army. Its first army, its professional army, was used in the initial invasion, 190,000 of them, out of an army of only 270,000, I think it was, 265,000. And they've used up that army now in the sense that it's been effectively dismantled and replaced by a second army, which was the army of conscription, the 300,000 men who were conscripted in late 2022 and 2023. Mobilised rather, and then conscripts have been added to that. And now it's on its third army, which is this kind of mishmash of forces from different parts of the world being paid with mercenary forces from all over the place. And there's the core of the first army there, the old elite units. There's elements of the mobilised army of the 22, 23, and then there's elements of this new army that are there. So they're on their third army. They get no real proper training. They get a bit of basic training, then they're sent straight to the front. And so they fall into operating very much in the old Soviet pattern. And then not very good.
Meat attacks,
certain things they can do.
Throwing people at the line.
Yeah, it's sort of human wave attacks. And they use their newest, cheapest soldiers or their foreign soldiers in the front line. They make them go ahead so they can mark the firing points of the Ukrainians, and then they attack the firing points. Wow. So they buy with their lives knowledge of where the Ukrainians are. And, of course, the Ukrainians have learned this, and they sort of, after their first firing points, they try and move pretty quickly. So the Russians are struggling militarily, but they can carry on because they've got more people coming through. They're not recruiting as many as they're losing. If they're losing 1,300 a day, they're still recruiting fewer than 1,000 a day, even though they're paying vast amounts for people now to sign on. But they can carry on. But the army is going to struggle into next year. So they can carry on like this for this year, but can we see a new, really vigorous Russian army appearing, in the spring this time next year? And I can't see it, either in equipment terms or in terms of really well-trained, reorganised manpower.
Do they still
they'll keep on turning the wheel on what they've got now.
Do they still have elite groups, Spetsnaz?
Yes, they do. Yeah, Spetsnaz are still there. And they've still got the VDV, the airborne. I mean, there's some elite units which have got a very distinguished background and distinguished themselves in Afghanistan. And, of course, many of the Guards tank armies, they're called Guards, incidentally. If it's like in elite status, they could be the first tank army, and then they're called the first Guards tank army, which is an honour. And some of their armies go back to their distinguished forces in the Second World War. So they still have their elite units, but you can't win a war like this only with your elite units. You've got to use those elites to build outwards to a mass army, because we're talking here about national mobilization on both sides. And the Russians are not able to create a national mobilized force with the skills of their core army, most of which they used up in the first 18 months of the war.
Absolutely. All right, Professor Clarke. Always good to speak with you. Thank you very much. I will speak to you again in the next couple of days, I'm sure. And thank you all for watching and for submitting your questions, as you always do. It's been a great discussion. It's always good to get Michael's expertise on these matters. And I think, diaries all being well, we'll do this again. We'll do this again next week.
I certainly hope so.
Let's do it. All right. Thanks very much for watching and have a great day.